Reginald Maudling was born in 1917 in Woodside Park, North Finchley. He was a prominent figure in British politics during the mid-20th century. Educated at Merchant Taylors' School and Merton College, Oxford, he achieved a first-class degree in Greats. During the Second World War, Maudling served in the Royal Air Force Intelligence Branch, rising to the rank of Flight Lieutenant. His political career commenced in earnest when he was elected as the Member of Parliament for Barnet in 1950. Over the years, he held several key positions, including President of the Board of Trade, Colonial Secretary, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Reginald Maudling's later career was overshadowed by controversies that marred his reputation. His involvement with the company Poulsen International became a focal point of scandal in the 1970s. John Poulsen, an architect implicated in widespread corruption, had financial dealings with Maudling's family company, prompting questions about the politician's judgment and ethical standards. While Maudling denied any wrongdoing, his associations raised suspicions of impropriety, especially given Poulsen's bribery convictions. A subsequent parliamentary inquiry criticised Maudling for conduct inconsistent with the high standards expected of a public official, casting a shadow over his otherwise distinguished career. These revelations significantly diminished his influence and legacy in British politics.
And now for something completely different.
And I'm singing just for you, covered in sequins.
Hello lovelies, and given that there's a whole bunch of new subscribers, welcome to my desktop of mystery and role-playing detritus, crumbs and beard care and things. This is where I do most of my reviews. I review a lot of games, new and old, though the old ones less a review, more of a kind of retrospective. And I try to cover stuff that's not D&D as much as possible. I view my role as something of an archivist, so I grab things that I think are important or could be important or were important, and I try to have copies of them in one form or another to stay informed, inspired, and aware of the role-playing game landscape as a whole. Which brings us to today, where we are looking at Monty Python's Cocurricular Medieval Reenactment program, a role-playing game. No, it isn't. So this comes from Exalted Funeral, who generally make good, competent stuff, perhaps something of an acquired taste sometimes. The game itself is a 350-some pages hardback with a ribbon. We like ribbons because, yeah, we're cheap and lazy. It's all full colour. I backed it on whatever it was that, that they crowdfunded on. And so it came with a few extras. I got a couple of sets of dice and some coconut halves made of plastic with which to... You're supposed to roll your dice in them, basically. But you can also make horsey noises, so that's a bonus. Monty Python looms large over the British cultural landscape, particularly comedy. They have influence that it's hard to overestimate. Sketch shows that came after them kind of followed after them in a lot of ways, and they helped shape and define British humour for a lot of people. You know, that slightly intellectual, slightly elevated, while at the same time crude and surreal. But you couldn't have had Monty Python without Spike Milligan and his Q series, and you couldn't have had Spike Milligan and his Q series without the Goon Show. And so if you like Monty Python, you should look into a lot of these other things. And then there's all the stuff that came after, like Gilliam's films, or things the other Pythons did. A lot of writing, a lot of other comedy shows, situation comedies, other things, Tompkinson's School Days from Ripping Yarns, musicals, you know, they just, they're important. They're important culturally to Britain, to comedy, and to me. And I think they're particularly important to gamers because that slightly elevated, surreal, slightly cerebral sort of sense of humour was big in universities at the same sort of times that role-playing games were coming up. And so the warp and weft of role-playing culture was very much tied in with Monty Python a lot. I don't think that's quite the case anymore. It used to be that a role-playing session was about 50% Monty Python quotes, particularly from the Holy Grail. Less so these days. The cultural currency of Monty Python seems to have decreased somewhat over time, which is a pity, because so much of it still works because it pricks at pomposity and because it's surreal and because it is that slightly elevated, slightly more intellectual form in its content. It didn't talk down to people. Monty Python's pretty much the antithesis of Mrs. Brown's Boys, put it that way, and it casts a long shadow over British culture, and it means a lot to me. So I had to back this, despite those kind of reservations that I have expressed, because I wanted to see that it was done right. But I'm not going to tell you what I really think until later. Okay, so it came with the coconut halves, and it came with some shonky dice. And I am not a fan of novelty dice, as you know, but I guess we all have computers in our pockets and apps that can roll dice with any number of sides and all the rest of it, so it's not necessarily a huge barrier to entry, and the only thing weird about them is the number of numbers, really, for most of these dice. So you have D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, D14, D16, D18, D20, and D30. So it's nice to see some DCC dice being used outside of DCC, and it also comes with these sort of, well, wound tracking dice, I suppose. One to cover how loony you've gotten, and one to cover how healthy you are. And so, you know, you follow the arrow, I think. Yes, virtually dead. No more. And so it goes, yeah, as you get harmed, and then the loony one, you know, you end up going bananas. So that's the dice part, really. Now, as I say, I'm not a fan of novelty dice. It's kind of appropriate for a Monty Python game. And it is nice to see some of these weird dice getting more use. Would have been funnier to have dice with sides that are impossible as a regular or semi-regular solid. Things like that would have been more Python-esque, but also unplayable. So I can understand why they didn't do that. Okay, so cracking open the book, you have some useful tables. There's a table, so you can determine what kind of table a table is. A sort of diviner, which solo players might find useful. A table for coming up with kind of surreal, wonky names. Shops, dogs, pussies. There's some pussy cats. So, butt, pussy willow, pussy footing, pussy tails, and puss in boots, and so on. Yeah, so I don't know if you've read any of the Monty Python series tie-in books, but they were a mishmash of stuff from the sketches and other random nonsense that they put together. And in so much as is possible in a game manual, much is also the case here. Your stats correspond to the dice types, as happens in quite a few games these days. Your stats are actually things called traits, and they can change, becoming more and less powerful through play. moving from silly at the D4 end to serious at the D20 end. That roll, whatever it is modified by accoutrements, which things that you have with you, or it could conceivably be just about anything. That then gives you a dice roll result that you compare against the difficulty to determine whether you succeed or fail. The traits are descriptive of your character and the things that your character can do. You can try to do things that you don't have, but you only ever roll a d4 for those. The traits, which are sort of combo stat skills, include things like animal husbandry, argumentation, authority, bardistry, chastity, decorum, druidry, glibness, heartiness, lawfulness, luck, nimbleness, purpose, sorcery, strategy, subtlety, valour, and wisdom in the ways of science, which is a lot to write into a character sheet. Crits are called struths, and you shift your trait up by 1 so it becomes more powerful temporarily, and then you roll the next dice and add on to your result. That's how you get crits. Fumbles are called spams, and rolling a 1 reduces your die type in the same way, and you get demerits. You can also get demerits from other things. Demerits gather mistakes and transgressions that you have made in the game, leading to beshrews, which are random and dependent on what the GM persona is. See, the Games Master also plays a character in this called the Head of Light Entertainment, or Whole. And that GM persona has a character, likes, dislikes, different tables of beshrews, and so on. Which makes the game kind of changeable and a little odd, but that's how we like it, I suppose. The Games Master, or Whole, can also hand out merits, which can then be used to cancel demerits or to buy an extra dice, rolling both, taking the highest, advantage being the thing. When you're not rolling against a static difficulty, you're rolling against other people. And that's called a contestation, and that's how you handle battle or anything where two sides are pitted against each other. And these are roll-off confrontations. Some enemies have to be beaten multiple times in multiple ways before they do actually surrender. Characters have health in the form of 6 levels of death and looniness, and you take damage as bits of death or bits of looniness. You can counter this by damage as well by discarding a retainer, being forced to eat your minstrels, or discarding an accoutrement in place of any harm that you take. So characters have a situation which is analogous to a class, which sets limits or provides advantages in various ways. Which capabilities you can have, certain restrictions and weaknesses, and a spiffing serious ability, which is like a game-breaking special capability beyond the scope of the normal rules which you have, and which affects how you can do stuff when you play. Different situations include churls, clerics, enchanters, eremites, knaves, knights, monarchs, monks/nuns, nobles, and troubadours. That would be relatively easy to add additional abilities if you find the game lacking in some way, and to create additional classes. It would be pretty simple, really. So yeah, as I said, the Games Master is the head of Light Entertainment and a character in and of themselves too. This is random. And so you're not the Games Master, but rather the Games Master playing the Head of Light Entertainment in a style and way determined at random at the start of play, and possibly even changing during play. And each of those different Heads of Light Entertainment has their own set of beshrews. So when you get too many demerits, then you get beshrewed, and something bad happens to you or your entire group. That's pretty much the rules there, and I guess we're kind of following the same kind of lines as the Discworld RPG is, in that the rules themselves are fairly light, have relatively few implications, and you should mostly just roleplay and repeatedly demand that the players better describe what they're doing. Seems to be the most important thing here. So as for the game itself, this isn't really the Monty Python role-playing game per se. It is the Quest for the Holy Grail RPG with some other elements of Monty Python worked in. That is how I would describe it. Like, you will find medieval versions of different characters and parts and so on that have been played in the series, different sketches, creatures and things that have been alluded to in various episodes of the show. So you will find that other stuff in here, but most of it, mostly, is given a kind of medieval twist. So you will find references to Life of Brian and aspects of Life of Brian. You will find Doug and Dinsdale Piranha and Spiny Norman given a slightly different sort of spin. I was glad to see Dennis Moore, because I think that's an underrated sketch with the Lupins, so I was very happy to see that. But yeah, you will find a lot of that sort of the bishop. You will find a lot of that sort of thing, but it's all given that kind of medievalist twist to place it within the Holy Grail sort of line, the Gumbies kind of barbarians, and so it goes, and so it goes, and so it goes. You get the idea. The conceit of the book and the game is that you are learning the real, true, and accurate history of Britain, and so role-playing is a way to live out that history and research it in some sort of way and give yourself an education. And there is actually, in keeping with Monty Python, a surprising amount that is accurate, but the majority is just surreal and a bit silly. We wouldn't want it any other way. We have lots of monsters and so on. Blancmanges instead of jellies, which is lovely. I was a bit disappointed in the chicken of Bristol, because it's just a chicken. I remember in a text adventure game of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the chicken of Bristol was a giant chicken and was actually quite dangerous, so that was fun. Right. I need to kind of work towards some sort of conclusion here. The Electric Penguin. It is well written, it is amusing, it is nice to see all the references, even if sometimes it's a bit tortured to fit them into the kind of medieval mindset. I always think example quests are a waste of time and should be put into separate books to make the core book cheaper, smaller, and more accessible, but there you go. So I like the writing. The game system is okay. It is perfectly cromulent. It is the kind of simple system that mostly gets out of the way that you need for a comedy game, I think. There isn't a huge amount of advice on how to be funny. In fact, it tells you don't worry about being funny. The absurdity will flow from the system, which is probably true to an extent. Comedy is, I hold this to be true, comedy and horror are the hardest things to make and to make happen at the table in role-playing games, and they share many similar problems with that. The way around that is often to be formulaic, so that anticipation does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, at least for comedy. You can't do that so much in horror. Horror works better if you surprise people with stuff. That's why jump scares continue, even though they're a cheap shocker. I have some niggles. Besides cramming everything into Holy Grail, I understand why they did that, so I'll give them a pass on that. The presentation, like some of this in the early section, is relatively unreadable or confusingly readable because of the style of letters. I understand the aesthetic choice, but still, there's not a great sense of Gilliam-esque presentation. Like, if you go back and you look at the books that Monty Python published, like their Big Red Book, or Big Red Book, as it was, things like that, it's obvious that a lot of the artwork was originally culled and collaged from newspaper. So you see the halftone, and you see that it has been colorized and so on, and so it has that very particular look, but there has been virtually no attempt to replicate that in this book. The illustrations are a bit more standard. I understand the difficulty in finding artwork, but a lot of the stuff could have been done in that same style, and for it not to be more Gilliam-esque feels like a misstep to me. For there not to be much in the way of his weird collage and airbrushing, it just feels a little bit odd. But I am glad to see that so much of it is illustrations and stuff that has been culled from old artwork. It's just not presented in a way that is evocative of Python, particularly. In terms of substance, I mean, it's a big book. The system itself really isn't that complicated and could have been reduced. It covers a lot of Python stuff, which is nice, but it could have done with a bit more in terms of how you should present the world. I think they should have given some comedy advice, but reading the book is a pleasure, even though if it's not quite right, and that's my criticism overall, I guess, is it's not quite right. It's not quite up to the standard I would have wanted, which is weak criticism, but it is criticism. And I hate novelty dice, but that's my problem. It's not necessarily anybody else's problem. Scores then. Style. I really wanted to be able to give it a 5 because so much of it is done right, but it lacks the Gilliam-esque twist that I was expecting and kind of wanted. I can understand why you might avoid that, but even so, that's a point down from me. So I mark from 1 to 5 typically. So style then 4. Substance. It is, so much is there, but it isn't quite right because of the forceful shift of everything into Holy Grail, right? I mean, even at the end of Holy Grail, they get arrested by modern police. So I think they went too far in the consistency slightly, and that's what kind of screws things up a little bit for me. So, and it is a thing to read. Role-playing games, you get to read them, you get to admire the artwork, you get to reference them during play, and they're a game, so that they have multiple facets to them. But still, substance 4, barely a 4, almost a high 3. So that's style 4, substance 4. Overall, that's 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. So that's very good. A recommendation with a few reservations about novelty dice, and getting this to the table in a playable form is going to be tricky for a lot of people, I think. And comedy is hard. Paranoia is really the only game to have ever gotten it exactly right, in my not so humble opinion. Zang.
Greetings, Jerkian warrior elite. Know this, that your existence is down to the orders of our portly potentate, and that without him you would not exist. Your very conception in the clone tanks of Clonius, the cloning planet, is ordained by his obese omnipotence, and from that very moment you owe him your life, your servitude, and your loyalty. To be a soldier in the glorious army of the Jerkian Empire is perhaps the best fate that can befall lowly matter in this universe. The Jerkian Empire is all-conquering, all-powerful, has the best uniforms, the most advanced weaponry, and the greatest leader the galaxy has ever known. Nothing can stand in our way, and you, even as lowly as you are, can die knowing that you are serving a far greater cause and a far superior people to any other in the universe.
Invaders is a comedy game of mishap and alien adventure, where you play the part of diminutive and comedically and epically incompetent alien invaders. You can get it at post-mork.com and drive-through RPG.